What's up guys? We got a very interesting announcement in Raid today. Usually I don't tend to make videos about updates like this, but basically we're getting a new champion that seems very interesting for PvP, and it's going to be something akin to free champions like Ninja or UDK, with a certain caveat that it's actually not gonna be fully free champion, but basically the TLDR version is that we're getting a champion pass, so it's basically gonna be just like Forge pass, except that you do it and you get a champion. So you're not gonna be able to get this new champion without paying. That's gonna suck to many people, but I don't know how much the price is gonna be. Hopefully something similar to Forge pass, which might be reasonable to some people and maybe not reasonable to others. But basically it's gonna be a limited time champion that isn't gonna be available after the event ends, just like Ninja and the other ones that we have had in the past. And this one has some very interesting implications for PvP. I haven't gotten to try him yet, but from the paper it looks like she might even be a top tier Nuker champion. Okay, so here we have the champion. It's going to be Xena, which many people might remember from their childhood from the TV show. And that's obviously going to be the reason why it's a limited time champion, because this isn't the IP that is owned by them and it's one of those deals like they did with Ninja. But more important than that, she actually looks like she might be interesting. Now, to be fair, we don't know her multipliers yet, and we haven't really gotten to test her in kit in practice. Often when we do, some things might seem better on paper than they are actually in practice, or some things might actually work better than it says in the tooltip, and it's actually way better in practice, like happened with Wukong A2. Many people were kind of skeptical that Wukong A2 is not gonna do any AoE damage, because the surplus hit after the initial damage cannot be critical. But then it turned out that it is still, like, it is counted from the original critical damage. Basically it is a critical, but it doesn't critical hit twice, but then all of the other damage multiplying effects are still calculated twice. So actually the AoE hit does way more damage than the original hit. But anyway, let's actually get into her kit. So A1 attacks one enemy 2 times, will ignore 3% of target's defense for each buff on target, will also ignore shield buffs if target is under 2 or more buffs or debuffs. And this is basically going to be her theme of her kit, that she is going to counter buffs and all of her skills are going to have synergy against them. And the TLDR version is that she seems kind of to be intended as Siphi counter, which you will see later in her passive and other parts of her kit. But for A1, 3% defense ignore per buff doesn't sound that huge deal. I'm not gonna assume that this skill hits very hard, but we will see, because of her other abilities that you will see later. If the A1 has very high or even average multiplier, then it would be a very strong skill. But still, having ignore shield and ignore defense on A1 is a pretty good A1, to be fair. And it is a multi-hit, so potentially if she has decent multipliers on this, you can even one-shot something like Rotos with this one. Then the A2 attacks all enemies, will ignore 5% of target's defense for each buff on the target, steals 20% of the turn meter from each enemy. This effect cannot be resisted if the target is under 2 or more buffs or debuffs. So again, this is everything in her kit is going to be against buffs, something like Siphi that is gonna go first in the fight and place buffs on every enemy champion. And I like the part here that she doesn't need any accuracy to steal turn meter, which is very good and something that they have been doing a lot lately with Nukers, because they have realized that it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any sense for their skills to require accuracy, because you're not gonna build any on Nukers. And because of polymorph, it's often not beneficial either. But ignore defense for each buff on the target, so it's not going to be insanely hard hitting skill unless it has crazy multipliers, which I don't think it's going to be, because then it would be insanely OP. But let's say that the enemy has 3 buffs, so it's 15% ignore defense and it's AoE and steals 20% turn meter from each enemy. It's good, but it's of course not going to be anything like Charge It or Rotos or stuff like that. But she has 2 AoE skills and both of them ignore defense, so it is pretty good. And this part where it steals turn meter from each enemy, it seems kind of interesting, and it might work very well with her passive, but I kind of want to see it in practice. But everything so far sounds very good. Then the A3 attacks all enemies, will ignore 10% of the target's defense or each buff on the target. Resets the cooldown of this skill if it kills 2 or more enemies. So again, it's basically kind of similar to the A2, but it has more defense ignore and it can be reset if she gets 2 kills. It's kind of weird nuance that she needs to kill 2 enemies, because on other champions with skills like this it's always been to get 1 kill, but she actually needs 2 to do good on this. But on paper it sounds very, very nice. We just need to find out the multipliers. But 10% for each buff sounds a lot more than the original one, so this can easily get to like 30% from something like Siphi and even more, because people do use a lot of buffs in the meta. So if she has maybe 50% or 30% ignore defense on this skill, then it's going to be a very hard hitting one, something like Rotos or Charge It, because it might be possible in certain situations to completely ignore the enemy defense. And as we know about the defense scaling, by the way, I have a video about it if you want to see how it actually works with all of the calculations and spreadsheets and so on. But even if enemy has a little bit of defense, it actually does mitigate damage a lot. And at certain like threshold, like let's say that everybody knows that 4.2k defense is basically the soft cap, and after that getting extra defense has very minimal effects and it's generally not worth the effort, except for in PvP, because you do often get a lot of your defense ignored. But the difference between, let's say, ignoring 50% or even 70% of enemy defense and fully ignoring enemy defense might sound like it's just a little bit more, but it's actually a huge deal. And if you fully ignore enemy defense, then no matter how trash multipliers are, it's gonna do insane damage. And then we get to her passive, and this is the part that really makes her seem very interesting to me, and why I'm calling her a Siphi counter. Well, and by the way, this is another feature that Plarium has been doing lately when they have been kind of ramping up the power creep, that most of the new, or not most, but the new top champions, they always have many passives. Like Taras has 5 million passives, and Maritska has 5 million passives, and many other champions do as well. But the first passive that she has increases this champion's attack by 10% every time they use an active skill, stacks up to 100%, resets each round. So it's basically exactly copied from Wall, which is nice, but it's kind of shame in the sense that Wall is very nice looking champion and very hard to get, and he has this exact same passive and nothing else except this passive, and he is kind of worthless. But she's basically the new improved version of Wall, who also has ignore defense, but she does multiple other things as well. So yeah, she does have that, and that might kind of counter Tara's passive, which does pretty much the exact same thing except opposite. Now you need to take into account that it says here, and this is how it works on Wall as well, that it gives her 10% attack every time they use an active skill. So that doesn't mean A1, so you're not gonna stack it as fast as you might think, but in a long fight in live arena, it's definitely not gonna be uncommon to fully stack this skill. And she does have her A3 potentially resetting her cooldown, so it might be slightly easier to do on her than most other champions. Then the second part of this first passive also has 50% chance of randomly changing this champion's weak hits to normal, strong or critical hits. The chance increases to 100% when attacking enemies under 2 or more buffs or debuffs. So that part is very interesting because that would basically mean that she's always gonna crit against something like Duchess, which again is actually very relevant in live arena or classic arena in general, but nothing else is gonna be viable except Ukraine Duo, so it is very unlikely that she would actually be used there because everybody is using Taras and Maritska in defense. But the big issue with 4 Nukers is Duchess, who puts Veil on everybody else in the team and you can only hit her, and she's insanely tanky and she can revive the entire team of herself with her like A3, and she can revive her entire team with her A3. But with this, you're always basically gonna crit on her if she does A2 or she has buffs from any other source on her team, and that's basically not gonna make like countering the weak affinity issue problem at all. Like basically the affinity isn't really relevant to her at all with this. Of course, if the enemy doesn't have any buffs on them, then it's only gonna be 50%, but even that is good, and generally they are gonna have at least 2 buffs, so the conditions to fulfill this is actually not very hard to accomplish at all, and generally it's gonna be like proccing every time, I would think. But we will have to see, and if it turns out that she's gonna be very relevant, then maybe even the meta will change in live arena and people will start using less buffs, but I doubt about that because buffs are so good and it kind of remains to be seen. She's still attack scaling Nuker, so she's gonna be very squishy and encounter a lot of issues that something like Taras, Rotos or Arima are not gonna encounter. But then to her second passive, fills this champion's turn meter by 100% and places 50% increased attack buff on this champion for 1 turn whenever 8 or more buffs are placed on the enemy team in a single turn. Now that might seem very crazy that 8 buffs, like that's a lot of buffs, but that means Siphi, like when she does her buffs, and Duchess or most other champions, if they generally they place 2 buffs on everybody or even 3, and that means that if they have everybody in the team alive, then this condition is going to be fulfilled. And basically if Siphi does the turn meter boost at the start of the fight, then Xena is gonna get attack buff and 100% increased turn meter and potentially cut in, and she ignores shields and defense and so on. So that sounds very interesting, which is why I was saying that she might be a potential Siphi counter. The one thing that I'm not quite sure with this one yet, because I haven't actually gotten to try her in practice, is that we know in how it works in this game that 100% turn meter doesn't mean that you're actually taking your turn next, and there can be multiple champions with 100% turn meter or even 150% turn meter. So this doesn't necessarily mean that she's always going to go after the Siphi turn meter boost. We have to try it in practice and kind of feel it out, but probably she's gonna be able to do it, or maybe go after the second, like Siphi does her turn meter boost, then they have 1 champion to go, and then maybe she will go. Or maybe if you build her really fast, then she will often go after Siphi turn meter boost. We kind of need to feel it out and try it in practice. But yeah, that's pretty much her kit. I kind of wanted to go through it because there's some nuance that is very relevant in top arena, and I'm personally hoping that this would kind of be a way for us plebs to maybe counter something like Siphi. If we let's quickly take a look at what kind of enemies I'm actually facing. I don't really recall what kind of battle logs I have here. So Siphi is very common in live arena. I would say that generally I see her in every fight. It's pretty rare to not see her. Usually Siphi is the first pick of everybody. Pretty much if you don't see Siphi, either I banned her, like I definitely did in this fight, or the enemy doesn't have Siphi. She's just that common. She's definitely the most used champion in live arena. And of course it's not just Siphi, it's Duchess and generally all of the revivers like Elva doing lots of boss. So this seems like it would be very interesting in live arena specifically. Now I don't know about classic arena. I feel like classic arena is kind of different, and everybody in top level at the reset is going to use Taras, Maritzka, UDK and Siphi as their defense. Like all of their top players are going to be using this exact same team. I'm not sure if it will work that well against it, because Taras is just going to one-shot her event through Necret and pretty much everything unless you have like block damage or unkillable. But because she is attack scaling champion, maybe if she also was HP scaling champion it could not be like that. But yeah, I think that's going to be issue. But if you can maybe lock Taras out or something, it might even work against this team. But I think definitely in live arena it's going to be a thing. So, and yeah, that's about it for the champion. That's the new update. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, it's basically going to be Forge Pass but for champions. And I don't know the price yet. I'm definitely gonna buy it, I'm gonna be honest. I mean, I'm not a big spender in the game, as lots of people know. I'm not against, wait, where is that? I'm not against buying stuff in the game. And I definitely have bought things in the past. I mean, at one point I used to very regularly buy daily game pack. But it's honestly probably maybe like 1 or 2 years ago when I was doing it. So I used to do that. I still always buy bolster forge passes, and I'm not against buying anything, but generally I don't honestly buy anything. But I'm definitely gonna go for this champion. I don't know what you guys think about this trend that Parium is kind of forcing some mandatory like investments on us. Probably some free-to-play players will be very unhappy about this. And there is one additional thing to note for those people, by the way. So this champion is going to be limited time, and it's going to be empowered by Elder Skark. This was confirmed by I think Banana Jam when I asked about it. And that's something to note. So if you have Elder Skark, you might potentially be able to make this champion even +4. Wait, where is he? Yeah, I don't sadly have Elder Skark. And some people might have empowered Elder Skark for Hydra, so that sucks. But even though you only get it, or like the main way to get it is from the Champion Pass, but during the Champion Pass event, there is also 3 different events for shard pulls. I think it was 2 events for Ancients and 1 event for Sacreds. And in those events, during that time period, you will actually be able to also pull Xena, and she will be a 10x champion in those events. So I think that is probably the only way for free-to-play players to pull her, which I advise you to, by the way, save for if you're interested of that. I will definitely say that if you're into PvP in this game, and you're okay with spending at least a little bit, I will probably go for her, but that's kind of gonna be up to you. I mean, I'm pretty sure I'm not gonna buy anything else for the rest of the year, but I will definitely buy the pass, so it is what it is. But anyway, that's the breakdown for Xena. Tell me in comments what you think about her, and when we actually get her, I will definitely make videos and try her in practice. And that's it. See ya.